The fence had never been a statement, never meant to provoke, and never designed to test authority. It was simply there, running straight and quiet along the edge of the property like a practical thought given physical form, installed years earlier to keep debris out, define a boundary, and offer a modest sense of order in a neighborhood that sold itself on order as a lifestyle. From the outside, the community looked like every brochure: promised trim lawns, identical mailboxes, streetlights placed with mathematical precision. But beneath that symmetry lived a culture that measured compliance with a ruler and enforced it with paperwork. The Homeowners Association governed this place with a confidence born from routine victories, warning letters that went unanswered, fines paid without protest, and rules followed because resistance felt exhausting. The fence had survived all of that quietly, passing inspections, weathering seasons, and blending into the scenery until the day the HOA decided it was a problem. The notice arrived without ceremony, folded into an envelope that used official fonts to imply inevitability, stating that the fence violated community standards and must be removed or modified immediately. There was no explanation that made sense, no citation that matched the reality on the ground, only a demand backed by a deadline. At first, it felt like a mistake, the kind of clerical error that happens when rules outnumber people. But the follow-up letter arrived faster, sterner, and more confident, asserting that the association had already reviewed the matter and would take corrective action if compliance was not achieved. That confidence was familiar. It was the tone of an organization accustomed to being obeyed. The property owner read the letters with the same disbelief felt by anyone suddenly accused of wrongdoing without cause, then walked the line of the fence, measuring, checking, remembering the original permit, remembering the survey stakes from years before, remembering the county markings that had been there long before the HOA existed. The fence, it turned out, didn't sit where the HOA thought it did. It sat on a narrow strip of land that belonged not to the association, not to any homeowner, but to the county itself, a public right of way that predated the subdivision, maintained in records that few residents ever bothered to examine. The association either didn't know or didn't care, because the next communication escalated quickly from warning to threat, promising enforcement and fees, implying that resistance would be costly. The owner responded with documentation, copies of old surveys, and a request for clarification. But the reply was silence, the kind that signals decisions have already been made elsewhere. Days later, trucks arrived early in the morning, their presence announced by the grinding sound of engines and the unmistakable posture of people who believed they were authorized to act. There were no introductions, no negotiations, no attempt to verify facts on site. There was only motion. Tools came out, cameras were mounted, likely to document compliance, and the fence was approached as if it were contraband. The destruction happened efficiently, piece by piece, panels detached and stacked like evidence, posts pulled from the ground with a practiced force that suggested this wasn't the first time. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, some curious, some uneasy, all familiar with the fear that comes from seeing authority exercised close to home. The HOA representatives moved with assurance, pointing, directing, filming, narrating their own version of events for the record they believed would protect them. The owner arrived mid-process, heart racing not from anger alone, but from the shock of seeing something taken without permission, and pulled out a phone, recording everything, not speaking, just documenting. The fence that had stood for years was reduced to fragments in less than an hour, loaded onto a truck, and driven away as if it had never existed. When the dust settled, the land looked exposed, a raw line where order had been forcibly erased, and the HOA left behind a notice claiming compliance had been achieved. That might have been the end in a different neighborhood, the kind of ending that teaches residents to keep their heads down and their properties bland. But this story didn't end there, because public land carries public consequences. The owner went back to the county records office, this time not to reassure themselves, but to prepare, pulling certified maps, recorded easements, and archived surveys that confirmed what had always been true. The fence stood on county land, and the HOA had no authority over it. More importantly, the county cared deeply about its property, especially when its destruction was captured on camera. A report was filed, not as a complaint, but as a factual account, accompanied by video evidence showing private individuals dismantling public infrastructure without permission. The response from the county was not slow or ambiguous. It was direct, procedural, and serious. Investigators reviewed the footage, compared it to land records, and recognized the problem immediately. What the HOA saw as routine enforcement, the county saw as property damage. What the HOA filmed to protect itself became the clearest proof against it. Notices went out, not to a homeowner this time, but to the association itself, informing them that an investigation was underway into the unauthorized destruction of county property. The balance of power shifted quietly but decisively, and the neighborhood, still unaware of the larger implications, remained calm on the surface. Beneath that calm, however, the machinery of accountability had begun to move, and it would not stop easily. The chapter closed not with resolution but with a realization settling over everyone involved, whether they knew it yet or not. Rules only matter when you actually have the right to enforce them, and cameras remember everything. The homeowners association carried on for several days as if nothing unusual had happened, confident in the assumption that enforcement, once executed, became history, and history rarely argued back. In their internal logic, the fence was gone, the problem solved, and any lingering discomfort among residents would fade as it always did. The neighborhood returned to its routines: morning jogs, lawn sprinklers clicking on at dawn, trash bins aligned just so. Yet beneath that surface normalcy, the absence of the fence created a visible scar that quietly drew attention. People noticed the exposed strip of land, the uneven soil, the abrupt ending where panels once stood, and some wondered aloud how something that had existed for so long could suddenly be declared illegal overnight. The HOA board, however, interpreted silence as acceptance, mistaking restraint for surrender, unaware that the real response was taking shape far beyond the neighborhood gates. At the county offices, the incident had already been logged, categorized, and escalated through channels designed for exactly this kind of overreach. Public land, unlike private disputes, triggered protocols that did not bend to community politics or internal agreements. Investigators reviewed the footage frame by frame, noting the logos on the trucks, the uniforms worn, the tools used, and the methodical way the fence was dismantled. They cross-referenced timestamps with permits, checked easement records, and confirmed what the documentation clearly showed. The HOA had acted without jurisdiction. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a technicality. It was a direct violation, carried out confidently, and recorded in high definition. The county's concern wasn't emotional or personal. It was institutional. When one organization destroyed public property without authorization, it set a precedent that had to be addressed, not just for this case, but to discourage future assumptions of power. While the HOA continued issuing routine notices to other residents, congratulating itself on maintaining standards, an official letter bearing the county seal was drafted, reviewed, and approved. It outlined the findings plainly, citing the specific parcel of land, the recorded right-of-way, and the absence of any permit allowing alteration or removal of structures on that land. The tone was not accusatory but firm, the language careful yet unmistakable, informing the association that it was under investigation for property damage and that further action might follow. When that letter arrived at the HOA management office, it did not blend in with the rest of the mail. It was heavier, more formal, and immediately unsettling to anyone who understood how authority actually worked outside the bubble of community governance. The first reaction inside the HOA was confusion, quickly followed by disbelief, then defensiveness. How could enforcing their own rules turn into a county matter? How could a fence, of all things, become a legal issue? Internally, Emails flew back and forth, board members reassured one another, and initial explanations formed around the idea that the county records must be outdated or misinterpreted. After all, the HOA had operated here for years, issuing fines, approving modifications, and maintaining common areas without interference. That long history of unchallenged control had created a dangerous assumption that longevity equaled legitimacy everywhere. Meanwhile, the property owner watched the situation unfold with cautious patience, resisting the urge to celebrate prematurely. Experience had taught that institutions rarely admit fault quickly, especially ones accustomed to compliance. Instead, evidence was organized meticulously, videos backed up, copies of correspondence archived, and timelines reconstructed, all in preparation for the inevitable moment when questions would be asked. Neighbors began to hear fragments of the story, whispers about the county being involved, about cameras, about the possibility that the HOA might have crossed a line. Reactions varied. Some felt vindicated, recalling their own minor disputes and wondering if those, too, had been exercises of unchecked authority, while others worried about what this might mean for property values, fees, and the stability of the association itself. The HOA attempted to regain control of the narrative by issuing a brief internal statement, framing the situation as a simple administrative clarification, assuring residents that everything was under review and that no action was required on their part. It was meant to calm nerves, but it also revealed anxiety, an uncharacteristic need to explain. The county, for its part, was unmoved by reassurance or spin. Follow-up requests went out, demanding records of authorization, communications regarding the decision to remove the fence, and identification of the individuals involved. Deadlines were set, and unlike HOA deadlines, these carried real consequences. Each unanswered question tightened the pressure, transforming what had been a routine enforcement action into a growing liability. The association's legal counsel was notified, meetings were scheduled, and for the first time in recent memory, the HOA found itself reacting instead of dictating. The fence, once an unremarkable structure, had become a symbol of boundaries misunderstood, of power assumed without verification, and of the quiet strength of documentation over bravado. As the chapter drew to a close, it became clear that this was no longer just about restoring a fence or assigning blame. It was about redefining who held authority over what, and reminding everyone involved that even the most confident rule-enforcers are still subject to rules they do not control. By the time the county's second letter arrived, the Homeowners Association could no longer pretend the issue was a minor misunderstanding destined to disappear with careful wording. The document was longer, more detailed, and noticeably less patient, outlining not only the potential violation but the expectation of cooperation, transparency, and accountability. It requested specific materials, internal emails discussing the fence, authorization logs, contracts with the crew that performed the removal, and any legal analysis that justified the action. This level of scrutiny was unfamiliar territory for an organization used to asking questions, not answering them. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting, the kind scheduled outside normal hours, marked urgent, and attended by people who suddenly realized that the rules they enforced so confidently did not shield them from oversight. Inside that meeting, confidence fractured into competing explanations, each board member remembering the events slightly differently, each version shaped by hindsight and self-preservation. Some insisted the fence had always been assumed to be within the HOA jurisdiction. Others recalled vague mentions of county land, but dismissed them as irrelevant at the time, and a few remained silent, perhaps recognizing too late that assumptions were not evidence. The association's attorney advised caution, recommending compliance with the county's requests while avoiding admissions of fault, a strategy that sounded reassuring but offered no immediate relief. Meanwhile, assembling the requested documents revealed gaps that could not be easily explained away. Emails showed a rush to enforcement, frustration over a perceived challenge to authority, and a troubling lack of due diligence before action was taken. There was no survey ordered, no consultation with county records, no pause to verify jurisdiction. The decision had been made based on precedent and confidence alone. The video footage, originally intended to demonstrate procedural compliance, now served as an unblinking witness to the moment authority overstepped its bounds. It showed representatives acting decisively, narrating their actions as justified, never questioning whether permission existed beyond their own interpretation of the rules. For the county investigators, this wasn't dramatic or personal. It was simply clear. Each frame aligned with the documentation, reinforcing the conclusion that public property had been altered without approval. As the HOA scrambled internally, the property owner continued to wait, understanding that patience often unsettles institutions more than confrontation. The absence of dialogue from the owner created space for the HOA's own narrative to unravel, forcing them to respond to the county rather than argue with a resident. Around the neighborhood, rumors evolved into conversations, conversations into opinions, and opinions into quiet assessments of the HOA credibility. People began revisiting past encounters, recalling times they had accepted fines or modifications without question, and wondering how many of those decisions rested on the same unverified assumptions. The association attempted damage control, issuing another update that framed the investigation as routine and emphasized cooperation, but the language lacked its usual authority, replaced instead by cautious phrasing that acknowledged external oversight. The county's presence changed everything. It introduced a level of accountability that did not bend to board votes or community sentiment. When inspectors visited the site, they treated the exposed land not as a neighborhood concern, but as a municipal asset, photographing the area, measuring impact, and noting the absence of the fence as a loss requiring remediation. They documented soil disturbance, potential drainage issues, and the cost of restoring the area to its prior state, all factors that would later influence the severity of the response. For the HOA, each new step felt like another crack in an image carefully maintained over years, revealing how fragile authority can be when it rests on habit rather than verification. Internally, blame began to circulate subtly, not openly yet, but in the careful distancing of language, in emails that emphasized collective decisions rather than individual responsibility. No one wanted to be the face attached to a misstep now under governmental review. The property owner observed these developments through updates from the county, recognizing the shift from investigation to consequence as an inevitable progression. What began as a fence dispute had evolved into a lesson written in paperwork, showing how power exercised without boundaries eventually encounters one it cannot cross. As the chapter closed, the HOA stood at an uncomfortable intersection, forced to confront not just a single error but the broader culture that allowed it to happen, while the county prepared to move from questions to conclusions, and the neighborhood waited to see whether authority would finally be held to account. The shift from inquiry to consequence arrived quietly, not with sirens or public announcements, but with a certified envelope that landed on the HOA desk, carrying a weight no routine notice ever had. Inside was the county's formal determination, a document that no longer asked questions or requested cooperation, but stated findings, cited statutes, and outlined next steps with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. The county concluded that the fence removal constituted unauthorized destruction of public property, supported by recorded land surveys, easement maps, and video evidence provided by both the HOA and the property owner. What had once been framed by the association as enforcement was now officially labeled damage, and that change in language altered everything. The document explained the county's obligation to protect public assets, emphasizing that intent was irrelevant when outcomes were documented and authority was absent. It listed potential penalties, including fines calculated to cover restoration costs, administrative fees, and additional sanctions if compliance was delayed. For the first time, the HOA was addressed not as a governing body, but as a liable party, subject to the same rules it so often invoked against others. The reaction inside the association was immediate and tense, marked by hurried meetings, lowered voices, and the realization that the usual strategies, assertion, delay, procedural maneuvering, would not work here. Legal counsel reviewed the letter carefully, highlighting the seriousness of the findings and the limited options available. Comply fully, negotiate terms of remediation, or contest the determination through a formal process that carried its own risks and expenses. None of those options resembled the effortless authority the HOA had wielded before. Board members who once spoke confidently about standards and violations now debated language, optics, and liability, recognizing that every response would be scrutinized by an entity far less forgiving than their residents. Meanwhile, the property owner received confirmation from the county that restoration would be required and that costs would be assessed to the party responsible for the damage. There was no gloating, no victory lap, just a sober acknowledgement that the process was working as designed. The fence, though gone, had left behind a record stronger than any physical structure, one that documented how easily authority could misfire when unchecked. News of the county's determination spread quickly through the neighborhood, carried not by official announcements, but by the subtle currents of community conversation. Residents shared screenshots, paraphrased findings, and speculated about what this might mean for dues, leadership, and future enforcement. Some felt uneasy, worried that fines levied against the HOA would eventually circle back to homeowners, while others saw the situation as overdue accountability, a reminder that power exercised locally still answered to broader laws. The HOA attempted to control the narrative once more, issuing a carefully worded update that acknowledged the county's involvement and promised to work toward resolution while reaffirming the association's commitment to community standards. But the tone rang hollow, stripped of the certainty that once made such messages unquestioned. The county's expectations were explicit. The damaged area must be restored to its previous condition, permits must be obtained, and a timeline must be submitted outlining corrective actions. Failure to comply would escalate penalties and potentially invite further oversight. For an organization accustomed to setting deadlines rather than receiving them, this reversal was deeply unsettling. Contractors were contacted, estimates requested, and the reality of costs became clear, revealing that what had seemed like a simple removal now carried a significant financial burden. Each dollar represented not just material expense, but a tangible consequence of acting without verification. The property owner watched as the machinery of remediation began to turn, understanding that the fence itself was no longer the point. The point was the precedent being set, the message sent to any entity tempted to act first and confirm later. County inspectors revisited the site, this time with an air of finality, marking areas for restoration and documenting compliance requirements. Their presence underscored the seriousness of the situation, a visible reminder that public land did not belong to the loudest authority, but to the law itself. Inside the HOA, conversations grew more strained as responsibility loomed, and subtle divisions appeared between those who had pushed for immediate enforcement and those who now questioned the culture that rewarded speed over diligence. The chapter closed on a quiet but profound realization spreading through the community. Authority is not defined by how often it is exercised, but by how accurately it understands its limits, and once those limits are crossed, even the most confident organizations must answer for the damage left behind. As estimates came back and spreadsheets filled with numbers that refused to shrink, the Homeowners Association confronted a reality it had never had to quantify before. Confidence carried a price, and this time it was not theoretical. Restoration costs climbed quickly once contractors assessed the site properly, factoring in soil stabilization, replacement materials, labor, permitting, and the administrative oversight required by the county to ensure public land was returned to its prior condition. What had once been a straight, quiet fence line now represented a complex project governed by municipal standards rather than HOA preferences, and every added requirement reminded the association how far outside its authority it had wandered. Board meetings grew longer and more strained, dominated by discussions of budgets, reserve funds, and whether insurance might absorb any portion of the expense. The answer, slowly and painfully clarified by policy language, was mostly no. Insurance covered accidents, not deliberate actions taken without jurisdiction. That distinction mattered, and it cut deep, transforming what some board members had dismissed as a technicality into a financial reckoning that would ripple through the community. Internally, conversations shifted from justification to mitigation, from asserting correctness to minimizing fallout, and the tone of leadership communications softened into something almost apologetic without ever fully admitting fault. Residents sensed the change immediately, reading between the lines of updates that spoke of unexpected obligations and external requirements, phrases designed to obscure responsibility while preparing people for consequences. The property owner, observing from a distance, felt a complicated mix of validation and unease, understanding that while accountability was necessary, the financial burden would likely touch neighbors who had never asked for this conflict. That awareness tempered any satisfaction, reinforcing the idea that unchecked authority harms more than just its immediate target. The county, unmoved by internal HOA struggles, continued to enforce its timeline, reviewing submitted plans, requesting revisions, and insisting on compliance down to the smallest detail. Each interaction reinforced a hierarchy the HOA had forgotten existed, one where community rules ranked far below public law. As deadlines approached, the association faced another uncomfortable question: how to explain to residents that their dues might increase or reserves might be depleted because of a decision made quickly and without verification. Draft statements were revised repeatedly, stripped of defensiveness, yet still careful to avoid explicit admissions that could complicate ongoing negotiations. Around the neighborhood, discussions grew more candid, with homeowners comparing notes, questioning past enforcement actions, and wondering aloud whether similar assumptions had shaped other decisions. Trust, once taken for granted, began to erode quietly, not through dramatic confrontations, but through subtle shifts in perception, as residents reassessed the competence and judgment of those tasked with representing them. The fence, long gone, lingered as an absence that spoke louder than its presence ever had, a daily reminder of how easily power can miscalculate. The property owner received notice that restoration would begin soon, accompanied by assurances from the county that the process would be monitored closely, ensuring no further overreach occurred. That oversight provided a sense of closure, yet it also highlighted the broader lesson unfolding in real time. Authority unchecked by verification eventually meets a boundary it cannot negotiate away. As contractors prepared to break ground and the HOA braced for the financial impact, the community stood at a crossroads, forced to decide whether this incident would be quietly absorbed and forgotten or remembered as a turning point that reshaped how power was exercised. The chapter ended not with resolution but with anticipation, as the cost of confidence became clear and the true consequences of acting first and asking later began to settle over everyone involved, setting the stage for a reckoning that would extend far beyond a single fence line. When restoration finally began, it did not resemble the swift, confident teardown that had started this entire chain of events. County, approved contractors arrived with permits displayed, inspectors scheduled, and procedures followed to the letter, every step documented not just for compliance, but for accountability. The process was slow, deliberate, and visibly supervised, a stark contrast to the HOA earlier assumption that authority alone was sufficient. Surveyors remarked boundaries, placing bright stakes that clearly showed where public land began and ended. a visual correction that felt almost instructional, as if the land itself was reminding everyone of facts that should have been checked from the start. Neighbors gathered at a distance, watching the methodical work unfold, noticing how often inspectors consulted maps and how frequently measurements were double-checked. It was hard to miss the symbolism. This was what legitimate authority looked like, grounded in records rather than routine. The homeowners association, now reduced to an observer of a process it had triggered but could no longer control, attended site visits with a noticeably different demeanor, careful, restrained, and acutely aware of every camera pointed their way. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same impulse that led them to record the fence's removal for protection had ensured that every misstep was preserved in detail. Those recordings, replayed and referenced throughout the investigation, became a case study in how documentation can reverse power dynamics. The property owner's quiet decision to record without commentary proved equally significant, providing a parallel record that reinforced the county's conclusions. In disputes like these, memory is malleable, but video is not, and the presence of indisputable evidence eliminated the ambiguity that often shields authority from consequence. As the new fence line took shape under county supervision, discussions within the HOA grew more introspective, marked by an awareness that their actions were now part of a public record that could be requested, reviewed, and referenced long after this case closed. That realization changed behavior quickly, introducing caution where there had once been certainty. Residents, seeing the process play out, began to ask different questions, not just about this incident, but about how decisions were made more broadly, how often jurisdiction was verified, and whether future enforcement would be grounded in fact rather than habit. The county inspectors, professional and detached, treated the situation as resolved only when documentation matched reality, emphasizing that compliance was not about intent or explanation, but about adherence to law. Restoration progressed, soil compacted, panels installed, and the land slowly returned to its previous state. Yet the emotional landscape of the neighborhood had shifted permanently. The HOA authority, once unquestioned, now carried a visible asterisk, a reminder that its power was conditional and reviewable. For the property owner, watching the fence reappear was less about reclaiming space and more about witnessing accountability made tangible, a rare moment where overreach met consequence without being buried in compromise. The chapter closed with a quiet but enduring lesson etched into the community's collective memory. Cameras do not forget, records do not bend, and authority exercised without verification eventually finds itself exposed, replayed, and corrected frame by frame, setting the stage for a deeper reckoning about trust and leadership yet to come. The restoration marked a physical conclusion, but it opened a far more uncomfortable chapter for the homeowners association, one that could not be repaired with lumber or labor. With the county's findings finalized and documentation filed, the incident moved from an active case to a recorded precedent, and that distinction mattered more than many initially realized. Public records meant accessibility, and accessibility meant that the HOA actions were no longer confined to internal memory or private dispute files. Anyone with curiosity, patience, and an internet connection could trace the timeline, read the determinations, and see how a routine enforcement action had transformed into a documented violation. Inside the association, leadership grappled with the implications of that transparency, recognizing that authority, once challenged successfully, does not reset easily. Board members faced scrutiny not just from regulators, but from residents who now felt empowered to question decisions that had previously gone unchallenged. Routine notices began to draw responses, requests for documentation increased, and enforcement slowed as verification became necessary rather than optional. The culture shifted from swift correction to cautious review, and while that change aligned more closely with lawful governance, it also revealed how much the HOA had relied on assumption rather than process. Residents began attending meetings in greater numbers, listening more carefully, asking questions framed not as defiance but as due diligence. Past grievances resurfaced in conversations, not always formally, but enough to remind leadership that trust, once cracked, rarely heals invisibly. The property owner, now largely removed from the day-to-day focus of the association, watched this evolution with quiet interest, understanding that the real impact of the incident lay not in fines or restoration, but in this altered dynamic. The county's involvement had recalibrated expectations, demonstrating that HOA authority was not absolute and that public law provided a framework residents could rely on when local governance faltered. That knowledge lingered, subtly reshaping interactions, emboldening some while unsettling others, who preferred the predictability of unquestioned rules. The HOA attempted reforms, introducing clearer documentation requirements and promising better communication, yet each effort carried the weight of recent memory, forcing leadership to prove rather than assert competence. The chapter closed on a community in transition, learning that authority under review behaves differently, and that once residents understand the mechanisms of accountability, the balance between governance and compliance can never return to its previous simplicity. What began as a dispute confined to a single stretch of land refused to remain isolated, spreading outward in ways that neither the homeowners association nor the neighborhood had anticipated. The incident became a point of quiet reference in nearby communities governed by similar rules, not because it was sensational, but because it felt uncomfortably familiar. Board members from other associations heard about it through informal networks, management companies, and shared legal counsel, recognizing in it the same habits they relied on every day: assumptions based on routine, enforcement driven by confidence rather than verification, and the belief that longevity equaled authority. Without naming names publicly, the story traveled, prompting subtle changes elsewhere as boards began checking land records, consulting counties before acting near easements, and reconsidering the wisdom of filming enforcement actions meant to demonstrate control. In the original neighborhood, residents grew more observant, noticing utility markers, drainage corridors, and strips of land they had never questioned before, realizing how much of their environment existed under layers of jurisdiction they barely understood. That awareness altered conversations at community gatherings, shifting them from complaints about aesthetics to discussions about rights, boundaries, and accountability. The HOA, now operating under the shadow of its own precedent, issued communications that were noticeably more detailed, citing statutes, attaching maps, and emphasizing collaboration rather than command. Enforcement slowed, not because rules had vanished, but because process had replaced presumption, and that change, though quieter, carried more weight. The property owner, no longer central to daily developments, became an unspoken symbol of how documentation could challenge authority without confrontation. A reminder invoked whenever questions arose about whether an action truly fell within the association's power. Beyond the neighborhood, the county's determination stood as a recorded example, accessible to anyone who searched for it, reinforcing the idea that public law did not bend to local governance structures, no matter how established they seemed. As the story continued to circulate, it lost its specific names but retained its meaning, transforming into a cautionary tale about overreach and the permanence of records. The chapter closed on a realization shared across communities: when authority collides with evidence, the impact extends far beyond the original point of contact, reshaping behavior, expectations, and trust in ways that cannot be undone by restoring what was physically lost. Time passed, and it came an unfamiliar quiet that settled over the neighborhood, not the comfortable silence of routine, but the measured stillness that follows disruption. The Homeowners Association, once quick to issue notices and assert standards, moved more cautiously now, its communications less frequent and its tone restrained. That absence of aggressive enforcement did not go unnoticed. Residents felt it in the way minor infractions were addressed with questions instead of demands, in the extended timelines granted for compliance, and in the careful language that replaced certainty with suggestion. Silence, in this context, spoke volumes, signaling an organization recalibrating its approach under the weight of recent experience. The property owner, observing this shift from afar, understood that the most significant change was not written in policy updates, but in behavior shaped by awareness of scrutiny. The county's involvement had introduced a form of accountability that lingered even after active oversight ended, influencing decisions through the memory of consequence. The neighbors began to test this new environment gently, asking for clarifications, requesting documentation, and occasionally pushing back in ways that would have seemed unthinkable before. Each interaction reinforced the idea that authority, once questioned successfully, must now justify itself continually. The HOA leadership grappled with this reality, recognizing that maintaining order now required transparency rather than assumption, and that trust, once fractured, demanded consistent effort to rebuild. Board meetings reflected this tension, balancing the desire to appear competent with the need to avoid further missteps, and the resulting caution reshaped the association's identity. The fence, restored and unremarkable once more, stood quietly as a physical reminder of a turning point, its presence less important than the process that had brought it back. Conversations about the incident faded gradually, replaced by a collective understanding that some boundaries, once illuminated, could not be ignored again. The chapter closed on this subdued equilibrium, where rules still existed, but were enforced with an awareness that silence, documentation, and patience could wield as much influence as any written regulation, preparing the ground for a final reckoning about what authority truly meant in a community that had learned to look beyond appearances. In the end, nothing dramatic announced the conclusion, no public apology, no grand statement of reform, no decisive vote that rewrote the association's identity in a single evening, because endings like this rarely arrive with spectacle. They arrive with acceptance. The homeowners association continued to exist, meetings still scheduled, dues still collected, rules still written and revised, yet something essential had shifted beneath the surface, altering how every action was weighed before it left the page and entered the real world. Fence stood once more along the edge of the property, ordinary and unobtrusive, blending back into the landscape as if it had never been the center of conflict, but for those who remembered, it marked more than a boundary of land. It marked the moment authority met proof, and discovered that confidence alone was not jurisdiction. Residents moved forward with a quieter awareness, no longer assuming that every notice carried unquestionable legitimacy, understanding instead that governance worked best when it was grounded in verification rather than habit. The HOA, shaped by consequence rather than intention, learned to pause where it once rushed, to check where it once assumed, and to document where it once relied on precedent. Some board members eventually stepped down, others stayed and adapted. But the culture they operated within no longer rewarded unchecked enforcement. The county's role receded into the background, its work finished yet its presence implied. A reminder embedded in public records that could be accessed at any time, preserving the lesson long after memories softened. The property owner returned fully to private life, no longer a point of discussion, having never sought attention, only correction, and in doing so demonstrated that resistance did not require volume when it was supported by facts. Over time, the neighborhood settled into a new normal, one less rigid but more stable, where authority and accountability existed in balance rather than opposition. The story lingered not as gossip, but as context, shaping decisions in subtle ways, influencing how future disputes were handled, and reminding everyone involved that power exercised without understanding its limits eventually exposes those limits publicly. What remained was not resentment, nor triumph, but clarity, the kind that redraws invisible lines and makes them impossible to ignore again. The fence had been torn down, restored, and forgotten by many, yet the line it revealed, between assumption and law, between control and consequence, remained firmly in place, defining the community more honestly than any rulebook ever could.